I'm Audrey, the director of the American Library in Paris, and I'm delighted to be with you here tonight and to welcome Dr. Popkin discussing his book about the French Revolution, A New World Begins. And before we begin, if you'll indulge me, I would love to get a show of hands of how many of you are American Library in Paris members. And if you have your video off, don't worry, add it to the comments. And bonus if you tell us what year you became a member. And I'm asking for a very specific reason, because our speaker this evening remembers coming to the American Library when he was a boy. So we always delight to hear about people's formative experiences at the American Library in Paris. So we have been lending books for 100 years. And since then, we've been a cultural touchstone and a meeting place for ideas. So I'm so delighted that you're part of our community. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And now to properly introduce our speaker this evening is Advancement Team Member Gabrielle McFarland.
Thank you, Audrey. As mentioned, I'm Gabrielle McFarland. And tonight I'm delighted and honored to be introducing Dr. Jeremy D. Popkin. Jeremy D. Popkin holds the William T. Bryan Chair of History at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. He is the author of over 20 books, including You Are All Free, The Haitian Revolution and the Abolition of Slavery and History of Modern France. In his latest, A New World Begins, The History of the French Revolution, Popkin puts readers in the thick of the debates and turmoil that ultimately led to the overthrow of the centuries-old French monarchy and the establishment of the world's first modern democratic republic. Building on his research on the Haitian Revolution and French press, Popkin presents us with a new understanding of the movement of which all modern and political social conflicts emerged. Dr. Popkin recalls reading the American Library in Paris's copy of the Thidwick, the Big-Hearted Moose, when his family spent a year in Paris in 1952. Between his childhood ties to the library and the timeliness of his work, we couldn't be more delighted to welcome him back. Welcome, Dr. Popkin.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be invited to talk to in this series from the American Library in Paris. And I've been seeing what years people say they joined, and I see I outdid you all. I came for the first time in 1952. And later, when I was a graduate student in Paris in the 1970s, read the library's entire collection of Ross Macdonald detective novels. But I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about my new book that was published about a year ago, A New World Begins, A History of the French Revolution. And having enjoyed picture books at the American Library, I have prepared some pictures for you. Let me see if I can share my screen here. There we go. And let's see. Okay, so my book, A New World Begins, is a comprehensive history of the French Revolution, everything you always wanted to know about the French Revolution. And one question I had to face right from the start, why in the early decades of the 21st century should anybody want to write a new history of the French Revolution in English? What is it that I could say that would be new to English language readers? I was going to show you that in addition to visiting the American Library in Paris when I was 3 and 4 years old, my interest in the subject goes back to that trip. My father liked to tell the story that when I was 4 that winter in Paris, I started bothering him with questions about what happens to people when they die. And in an attempt to explain that to me, he took me to see Napoleon's tomb at the Invalides. And while I have no personal memory of this expedition, I assume that that's where my interest in the subject of the French Revolutionary era began. For Americans, of course, the French Revolution has always been a subject of interest because of the connections between our two revolutions. The role of the Marquis de Lafayette in the American Revolution has always symbolized this connection. I'm speaking to you from Lexington, Kentucky, located in Fayette County, Kentucky, named for our heroic French ally. And of course, the ideas of liberty and equality that marked the American Revolution are very similar to those of the French Revolution. And I begin my book with a quotation from a poem published in Lexington, Kentucky, in what was then the most westerly newspaper in the new United States, the Kentucky Gazette, in 1793, praising the French Revolution and urging Americans to support it. But I do point out in that opening passage that the poem also shows how easy it was for Americans to misunderstand the French Revolution. This poem, written at the moment when the French revolutionaries were doing everything possible to uproot religion in their country, for example, invoked God's blessings on the French revolutionaries, something that would have surprised Robespierre and Danton and the other revolutionary leaders who were then in power in Paris. So there is always a challenge in explaining the French Revolution to American readers. It seems in some ways a movement very familiar, similar to our revolution, but in other ways very, very different. One reason, of course, why the American and French revolutions were different and took very different courses was that France was a country with centuries of tradition and customs that had become deeply rooted in the country's life, and very different from the United States, where people saw themselves as living in a new world where new ideas could easily win support and be adopted. In my thinking about the French Revolution, I've come to emphasize the importance of traditional forms of behavior and traditional forms of belief, such as the religious belief in the Catholic Church. It's true that these had been challenged in the 18th century by the new ideas of the Enlightenment, but we shouldn't underestimate the force of tradition and of habit in this society that made it more difficult to break with the past than it was in the American colonies when they freed themselves from Britain. In addition, the social tensions in France at the end of the 18th century were much greater than those in the United States. This caricature emphasizes the gap between the privileged classes represented here by the the pictures of women from the Catholic Church, the nun and the noblewoman with her fancy dress and her fancy hat, and the woman of the common people with her wooden shoes, as you can see there, who is shown bearing this burden of the privileged elites on her back. In the United States, of course, particularly in the southern states, there was the oppressed class of enslaved blacks, but among the white population, the social differences were not nearly as great as they were in France. So when King Louis XVI found himself compelled in 1789 to take the extraordinary step of asking the population of France to send deputies to Versailles, to a meeting of the Estates General, to help him find ways to overcome the government's financial crisis, he set in motion a process that very quickly, from his point of view, got completely out of hand. People were not just content to be asked to give their advice to the king, but they now demanded a right to have a real say in how the country was going to be governed, and what laws it was going to live under, and what taxes it was going to pay. And when the king appeared to resist this movement, as we all know, on the 14th of July, 1789, a crowd of the citizens of Paris stormed the medieval fortress of the Bastille, the tourist attraction in Paris that first-time visitors from the United States go to look for and are disappointed that it cannot be seen at all because it was immediately demolished after Bastille Day. And that, of course, is the picture that is on the cover of my book. When my publisher was putting the cover together, they asked me if I had any suggestions for the cover, and I gave them some that I thought were more original and more interesting than this picture, and they came back with this. And I said to my editor, this is the most banal and overused image of the storming of the Bastille that you could possibly come up with. And my editor said with a smile, that's exactly why we chose it. Everybody will immediately know what the book is about. And of course, they won the argument. The picture, like many other similar pictures of the storming of the Bastille, is significant, though. It shows the moment of victory when the crowd has forced the commander of the Bastille to surrender. The clouds of smoke remind us of the violence of this affair, and so do the bodies on the pavement here. And we are seeing the moment before the angry crowd lynched the commander, the officer Delaunay, and cut off his head, which they then paraded around the streets of Paris. So this image manages to capture the combination of exaltation, the sense that we have won our freedom, but also of the violence that was going to be present throughout the revolution, the conviction of the people who supported the revolution that their enemies were prepared to use violence against them, and that therefore the only way to defeat them was to be prepared to use violence themselves. But the goal of the revolutionaries, as I try to explain when I talk, for example, about the debates over the great statement of principles issued by the French revolutionaries a little more than a month after the storming of the Bastille, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, their goal was what they saw as a world from which the tyranny and oppression of the past would have been banished, and in which violence would become completely unnecessary because all people would have their rights and understand their rights and be able to participate in a government that would protect those rights. I always like this image, which is one of the ones reproduced in my book, of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, because it brings out so clearly what the revolutionaries imagined they were accomplishing. The Declaration itself, by the strength of its words and its principles, would mark the boundary between the new world of light and liberty and happiness. All these people dancing around the maypole here with a liberty cap on it, and a mother showing her child the principles of the Declaration that were going to make sure that he had a happy life. And on the other side, hidden by the Declaration, the world of the past with its lightning bolts and its darkness and its people creeping in the mud here. And you can sense the the feeling that the French revolutionaries have that they were truly fighting for a great cause to create this kind of world of sunlight rather than this kind of world of darkness and storms. But they had great challenges in how to do that, and they needed to come up with leaders who could function successfully in this new kind of society. As I was writing my book, I realized I was encountering many fascinating characters. One of them, of course, Count Mirabeau, the great leader of the Third Estate in the early stages of the French Revolution. I read over and over again in letters and memoirs from the time of the overwhelming impression he made when he spoke. He was a great orator who could hold the attention of a crowd of thousands, must have had a very loud voice. Having done some of my own original research on the history of the press during the French Revolution, I knew that he was one of the first politicians to be fully at home using the newspapers to spread his ideas. He hired a team of publicists who wrote under his name and made him one of the most effective revolutionary journalists. He had the knack for coming up with ringing phrases that would reach the common people. But he also had some of the weaknesses that we have seen in many Democratic politicians then and since. We know that he very quickly began to take secret subsidies from the royal court, promising them that if they would listen to him, he would discredit the more radical revolutionaries and take the revolution on a course that would wind up strengthening the power of the monarch rather than weakening it. So he was playing a dangerous double game, saying one thing in public to the revolutionary assemblies and the crowds, another thing in private in his letters to the court. And when his secret connections to the court were exposed after his death, it had a devastating effect on people's trust in revolutionary politicians. If you could not trust Mirabeau, if he had been secretly deceiving the supporters of the revolution, who could you trust? And he wound up, unfortunately, contributing to the atmosphere that led to the Reign of Terror. Mirabeau and Maximilien Robespierre met for the first time when the Estates General convened in May of 1789. Mirabeau, after his early encounters with Robespierre, is supposed to have said, "That man is dangerous. He believes everything he says," which, as I've just been saying, was certainly not the case with Mirabeau. Robespierre emerged in the early months of the revolution as the most articulate defender of the idea that all men have universally valid natural rights. If you are a believer in democracy the way we have come to define it in the United States and France today, that everybody should have an equal right to vote, that all citizens are equally important, you have to recognize yourself in some of the arguments that Robespierre made in the early years of the revolution. He was the most determined defender of the idea of universal suffrage, at least for men. He was a very eloquent defender of freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the rights of the poor, the right to welfare for people who could not support themselves. But all of you know, I'm sure, that he also was going to become, just a few years later, the most prominent leader of the dictatorial Committee of Public Safety and the Reign of Terror of the Revolution. And one of the challenges for any historian of the French Revolution is to try to make it comprehensible how this man of principle this man who was nicknamed the Incorruptible because unlike Mirabeau, nobody thought he could be bought. Nobody thought that he believed anything in private that he didn't say in public. But how he becomes then the symbolic leader of the Reign of Terror is one of the great enigmas of the revolution. So I was learning as I went along writing my book how many challenging things there are to explain in the history of the French Revolution. One of the things I wanted to accomplish in my book, and one of the reasons why I thought it was time for a new general history of the French Revolution for non-academic readers, was the new, to bring in the new research that has been done on the role of women in the French Revolution. This was shown most dramatically in the events of the so-called October Days of 1789, when a crowd of some 20,000 women marches from Paris to the Palace of Versailles to demand that the king stop dragging his feet and endorse the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and the other radical reforms the revolutionaries had already made, but also that he do something about the economic crisis that was making bread too expensive for women to buy for their families. This event has always been mentioned in histories of the French Revolution. Traditionally, in older histories, as an example of how easy it was for the mob to get out of hand during the revolution. But more recently, as we have come to appreciate the importance of women's actions during the revolution as the clearest demonstration of the fact that it was not just a men's movement, but one in which women also played a very significant role at many points. As I was trying to come to a good understanding of the revolution myself so that I could share it with readers, I came to appreciate also the immense consequences of the way the revolutionaries tried to solve the budget crisis that had led Louis XVI to assemble the Estates General in the first place. The king had hoped that the Estates General would approve new taxes, and that would get him out of his problems. Once they had taken power from the king after the storming of the Bastille, however, the legislators of the National Assembly were convinced that this was not a good time to try to raise taxes. That would make people feel that the revolution was not working in their favor. But they wanted to pay back that debt. They didn't want the government to go bankrupt. So they came up with a very clever idea, one that by all rights really should have worked, and that was to expropriate the lands and property of the Catholic Church. The church had become, over the centuries, this was part of that legacy of the past that I mentioned earlier, immensely wealthy. And the idea that the church didn't really need all that money, that the true message of Christianity was that the church should be poor and not rich, made it seem logical to the deputies that the nation should take over the property of the church, sell it off to create a new population of independent property owners in France, and use the money to pay off the government debt. It was a brilliant scheme, and on paper it made perfect sense. But the revolutionaries may not have realized when they took this course that they were starting a quarrel that was going to divide the country bitterly down the middle. More than the limiting of the powers of the king, which was generally popular, or the abolition of the special privileges of the nobility, again, popular with the vast majority of the population. The reform of the church that was made necessary once you sell off the church's land and its sources of income, you've got to find a new way to keep it operating. That was something that was going to affect almost everybody in the country. About half the population seems to have accepted the idea of a new reformed church structured by the revolution, but another half of the population bitterly resisted it. On this map, the darker départements are ones where the religious reform went through without a great deal of resistance. The lighter colored ones, however, are areas where there was a strong backlash. So more than anything else, the religious quarrel that followed from this brilliant scheme to solve the country's financial problems resulted in a sequence of events that led to increasing violence. One of those was the king's attempted flight from the kingdom in June of 1791. There are Louis and Marie Antoinette and their children in the carriage. One of the things that motivated the king, who was a good devout Catholic, to make this attempt to flee was his opposition to the religious reform. And of course, that made the supporters of the revolution more distrustful of him than ever. Another theme coming out of my own research that I wanted to get into its proper place in the story of the revolution was the French revolutionary struggle with slavery. I did not know when I began studying this issue and its role in the French Revolution about 20 years ago, that in the year 1789, there were more enslaved Blacks in France's Caribbean colonies, Martinique and Guadeloupe, which are still départements of France today, and the much larger colony of Saint-Domingue, which is today's independent nation of Haiti, than there were in the 13 United States. But I learned that the question of slavery and the question of how to keep France's immensely profitable overseas empire while promising to the white population that all men were created free and with inalienable rights was a central issue for the French revolutionaries, just as it was for the American ones. A few months after the king's flight in France showed how divided the country had become, the largest slave uprising in recorded history broke out in France's colony of Saint-Domingue. And for the rest of the revolutionary period, the French revolutionaries and then Napoleon were going to have to decide how to deal with this issue and what they were going to do about this insurrection. The first reaction of the revolutionaries back in France when the news of the slave uprising arrived in October of 1791 was not to say, oh, the Blacks deserve freedom too. It was instead to send troops to defend the white population and force the Blacks back into slavery. But as I show in my book, that effort was unsuccessful, and it would lead revolutionary France to become the first country in the Western world to decree the abolition of slavery in February of 1794. With all these problems hanging over them, you would have thought the revolutionaries had enough on their hands. But as you read my book, you will discover that it was the most radical revolutionaries who decided in the spring of 1792 that the solution to their problems was to declare war on the other powers of Europe. This war, as the famous French historian of the Revolution, Georges Lefebvre, memorably said, changed everything. For those who supported the revolution, they flocked to join the army, as you see in this picture, and this became a great patriotic crusade for liberty. But those who opposed the revolution were now not just political opponents, but they appeared to their fellow citizens as outright traitors, people who were betraying the country when it was faced with foreign enemies. And that was going to lead quite rapidly to the final overthrow of the monarchy on the 10th of August, 1792, and to the trial and execution of Louis XVI, who had unquestionably sympathized with France's enemies and hoped that they would defeat the French revolutionary armies and conquer Paris. Those of you who have the good fortune to be in Paris at the moment, I suspect all of you at one time or another have stood in front of the statue at the Odeon metro station of the great revolutionary orator Danton, rousing the French people to fight off the foreign enemies. And, it's a memory of that revolutionary spirit inspired by the war. But the war also led to the outbreak of a civil war in Western France, the counter-revolutionary uprising of the Vendée. And this, more than the reign of terror with the guillotine in Paris, was the bloodiest aspect of the French Revolution. To the revolutionaries, this peasant uprising in the Vendée was completely incomprehensible. The revolutionaries thought of themselves as doing everything for the common people of France. They could understand why the king opposed them, why Catholic priests might oppose them, why former nobles might oppose them. But when they were confronted with an uprising of poor peasants, they could only think that some terrible conspiracy was at work, that the enemies of the revolution must have found some way to mislead these people, and that whatever it took, they had to be defeated. So many more people were killed in the fighting in the Vendée, including many innocent civilians, than were killed during the terror in Paris. The war and the Vendée uprising and the other problems facing the revolution inspired an ever more radical populist trend among the revolutionaries. And here you see especially the role of the popular media. This is a copy of the Père Duchesne newspaper that I discuss frequently in my book, the most widely circulated popular newspaper during the radical phase of the French Revolution. This image of the ordinary revolutionary, the sans-culotte, that appeared on the front page of this paper in every issue is, I think, the most eloquent image of the role of the common people during this radical phase of the revolution. The Père Duchesne, whose real name was Jacques-René Hébert, had one recipe for every problem facing the revolution: more violence, more extremism, more drastic laws, more executions. He was constantly pushing the revolution in a more radical direction. He was one of those who called for the execution of Marie Antoinette and made terribly slanderous accusations against her. Not only that she was an opponent of the revolution, which was certainly true, but he accused her of being a denatured woman with such a strong sexual appetite that she had even committed incest with her son, a charge that shocked even some of the supporters of the revolution. Marie Antoinette, I should add, was one of the many people I had to write about who I came to understand quite differently as I was writing the book. We remember her for that silly thing that she never actually said, "Let them eat cake." But as the revolution proceeded, she became a much more determined and, I would say, clear-sighted opponent of the revolution than her husband, Louis, who could never quite rouse himself to do everything possible to defeat the revolutionaries. And well, I came to see her as a very determined woman who knew that she was playing a very poor hand, but was determined to play it as skillfully as possible. But at the same time, as I came to respect her talents as a counter-revolutionary, I also came to see that her execution was justified, not on the grounds that Hébert advanced, but because she really was one of the most skillful enemies of the revolution. And another figure who I had to rethink was Robespierre. The public image of Robespierre is of a fanatic, a bloodthirsty dictator. Many historians and biographers who have written about him in the past few decades have shown that this is a very misleading way of seeing him. He did evolve a long way from the kind of libertarian figure I mentioned that he was at the beginning of the revolution. But he can be seen, I think, as trying to make sure that the revolution triumphed, but to keep it from going in the kind of overboard in the direction that the Père Duchesne would have liked to push it. I think most historians now see him as a figure trying to find a middle way between outright violence, violence that escapes from control, and being too moderate and allowing the enemies of the revolution to undermine it. But he did have a terrible weakness for conspiracy theories. He was easily convinced that other people were traitors to the revolution. And the most famous example of that, of course, is his decision to support the trial and execution of Georges Danton. Danton is a much easier figure to love in some ways than Robespierre, and that's why he has a statue on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, and Robespierre most definitely does not. And I hope some of you have had the chance to see the 1983 film in which Gérard Depardieu does such a magnificent job of losing his head. But to Robespierre, Danton had come to seem too unpredictable, too untrustworthy, perhaps another Mirabeau saying one thing in public and behaving differently in private. And Robespierre then agreed that Danton had to go. After the reign of terror came to its abrupt end when the other deputies to the revolutionary legislature overthrow Robespierre on the 9th of Thermidor, the 27th of July, 1794, Robespierre did become the victim of a conspiracy. It was a conspiracy to blame him for all the excesses committed by the revolution up to that point. And this was very convenient for the politicians who survived Robespierre if they could spread this myth that Robespierre alone had been responsible for all the terrible things that happened in the revolution. They could justify the fact that they continued to remain in power. The terror certainly was a traumatic period in French history. I'm always moved by this picture by a woman, commissioned by a woman who survived the terror, but very narrowly. Afterward, she had herself painted holding her hair after it had been cut off in preparation for her impending date with the guillotine. So the revolution did have, the radical part of the revolution did have a traumatic effect in France. But the end of the reign of terror was not the end of the revolution. And the years that followed from 1794 until Napoleon Bonaparte's coup d'etat in 1799 were the years in which the revolution expanded to much of the rest of Europe as revolutionary armies conquered Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and the Italian peninsula, and brought many of the principles of the French Revolution to the rest of the continent. Among other things, everywhere the French went, they forced the adoption of new republican constitutions with declarations of rights, and they brought this idea to the populations of the areas they invaded. It was during these years, too, that the Black leader Toussaint Louverture, who had been a participant in the uprising against the French, went over to the French side and rose through the ranks of the French army in Saint-Domingue, fighting the British and the Spanish until he became the commander of the French forces. And that was what put him in a position to make himself ruler of what had been France's most valuable colony. Similarly, a much younger military officer, Napoleon Bonaparte, rose to power as the hero of the army of Italy and the French conquests of Italy, and then, of course, went on his famous expedition to Egypt in 1798, which gave him a great reputation. But we can also see it as one of the many consequences of the French Revolution, that it started the modern period of conflicts between Western European powers and the Islamic civilizations of the Middle East that we are still living with today. Of course, you all know that Napoleon then uses his prestige as the most successful general coming out of the French Revolution to overthrow the French Republic and the coup of the 18th of Brumaire, the year 8, the 9th of November, 1799, and to quickly erect a kind of dictatorial regime in France. If there is a controversial aspect to my book, if it ever gets translated into French, I expect this will be one of the most controversial aspects of it. I give a more critical evaluation of Napoleon than the French are used to. Napoleon was a master propagandist who sponsored visual propaganda like this of all the great things he did for France in the first few years of his reign as first consul before he became emperor. And there is no doubt that he managed to end many of the controversies that had started during the revolution. In particular, he found a compromise to end the religious conflict that I mentioned earlier. And there's no doubt that he was genuinely popular in France. But we have to recognize also that he ended anything that we could call liberty in France and anything resembling democracy. And more than other authors who have written about him, I think I do stress that he reintroduced slavery in the French colonies with a law in 1802. And this provoked the final stage of the Haitian Revolution, the bloodiest phase of that conflict, which led to the independence of Haiti at the beginning of 1804. He also introduced a law banning Blacks from living in European France, the first openly racist legislation in French history. The National Day of Commemoration of the Slave Trade, of slavery and their abolitions, that is now an annual event in France, is held on the 10th of May every year because that is the date on which Napoleon reintroduced slavery in the French Empire, and it is a sort of date of shame in French history. And another of the achievements of which Napoleon was very proud was his enacting of the Civil Code, the Code Napoleon, which with many amendments is still the basis of French law today. But I point out in my discussion of it that while it created a very rational and clear and system of law in France that had many benefits for the male population, it took away all the rights that women had gained during the revolution. Women never got the right to vote, but they had been given equal rights within the family, equal control of family property and of the children, and equal rights to sue for divorce. And that is an aspect of Napoleon's legacy that I think needs to be remembered also. In the long run, as I say at the end of my book, and I'm just about to end here, the French themselves eventually coalesced around agreeing that the principles of the French Revolution should be the basis of their national life. It took a while. Bastille Day did not become a public holiday in France until 1880, 90 years after the French Revolution had taken place. And it wasn't just Napoleon who resisted granting rights to women. The French Republic did not give women the right to vote until 1944 at the end of the Second World War. But in the long run, the principles of the French Revolution have prevailed in France. And along with the American Revolution, the French Revolution, I conclude in my book, remains one of the essential sources for our modern ideas of liberty and equality, even if the revolutionaries themselves did not always live up to the principles they declared, and if they engaged in a great deal of violence supporting them. So I'd like to stop the screen share there, and I hope we have some time for questions left.
Well, Dr. Popkin, thank you for walking us through a revolution. I have to say, when I read your book, I was in full appreciation of your inclusion of women's role in the revolution and your focus on how incidents in France's colonies played out at the same time. The revolution in Haiti had been something that I treated as an event almost completely separate from the revolution. So I really appreciated your approach. And I'm just curious, was there a moment or an event that prompted you to take on this book and prompted you to make inclusion of women, the revolution in Haiti, the directory government of 1789 to 1799, taking that on as your angle, taking that on as what was missing, the gap in literature on.
Well, precisely what you just said is exactly what I had in mind. There wouldn't have been much point to just rewriting existing histories of the French Revolution. And I really thought there was a chance to bring to readers who are not part of the inside baseball discussions among professional historians of the French Revolution, these new ways of looking at the revolution that are largely omitted in earlier histories of the revolution.
Well,
I see we have quite a few.
We have quite a few questions. The first question is asking us to revisit that the religious reform and the sale of of church land. Someone is asking if those sales of church land were inspired or motivated at all in part by actions across the channel by Henry VIII with the dissolution of monasteries.
I don't know that they were thinking specifically of Henry VIII, but obviously what had happened with the Protestant Reformation throughout the countries that had become Protestant was in their minds, that it proved to them that you could still have a Christian church without vast landed properties, and they didn't see themselves necessarily as doing something terribly radical. I see somebody wrote in the chat, France had a revolution to be free from religion and not to have freedom of religion. One of the things, and I hope this also comes through in my book, that is, that we have realized more in recent years. At the beginning of the revolution, many very sincere French Catholics, including many priests and even some of the bishops, thought that the revolution was a tremendous opportunity to regenerate the French Catholic Church, to make it a more Christian, a purer form of Christianity. They themselves thought the church has gotten too caught up in acquiring wealth for itself, the difference of the standard of living between the aristocratic bishops who notoriously rarely performed any religious duties at all, and the parish priests who were involved on a daily basis with the problems of their parishioners was very evident to many people. And some of the figures in the revolution I came to feel the most sympathetic with were these priests and other figures in the Catholic Church who went into the revolution thinking we have a chance to re-Christianize France thanks to the revolution, and then discovered that the revolution was going to turn more and more against the church. And this plays in also to the argument about Robespierre's role in the revolution. He does not support the attempt to uproot the church altogether. He's not an Orthodox Catholic, but better than many of the other revolutionaries, he understands what religion means to a lot of people. And he understands that you can't just by decree tell people that they are not to pray, that they are not allowed to be buried anymore with a tombstone expressing a hope for resurrection, because the official dogma was, as the revolutionaries proclaimed, death is an eternal sleep. And that is an aspect that could lead you to see Robespierre as a more moderate figure compared to people like the Père Duchesne, for example, who is all in on uprooting the church totally.
It's interesting that you say that, because there's this ongoing debate now in France about laïcité,
Yes.
and obviously a lot of folks trace that back to the revolution and base it in the revolution. But you're kind of pushing on the opposite. There's more nuance here, and there's actually a push to re-Christianize France.
In the early years of the revolution, definitely. And under Robespierre, there is an attempt to create a new state religion, the cult of the supreme being. So yes, the people who are saying laïcité is one of the great creations of the revolution should read my book. It's not that simple.
So I have another question here. Over the years and decades of studying the revolution, how have you seen your understanding and interpretations change, and what do you see on the horizon for the future of scholarship? I think this kind of plays also into modern day topics about laïcité and its role today.
Well, the revolution is fascinating, at least to me, because everything is in there. Every issue that modern societies have to deal with comes up during the French Revolution. And as I've already said, it's been a continuing process of discovery for me. I began my career with some books on the press during the French Revolution, and had no idea how important the media had been in the revolution at the time, and I thought I was making new discoveries in that area. In all the books I read when I was a student, and one of my former professors, I believe, is actually on this call here today, can confirm this perhaps. Nobody ever mentioned that France had slave colonies and dealt with the issue of slavery. It was simply something that wasn't gotten completely left out of the histories of the French Revolution for much of the 20th century. So it was a shock for me when I discovered it, and I was really intrigued and went on to do a lot more research in that area. I can't claim great credit for introducing the issues of women and gender into scholarship on the French Revolution, but as my colleagues, French and American, explored that dimension of the revolution, I saw that here was something that was very important. I always tell students it's amazing, until the 1970s, nobody knew that half of the world's population throughout all of history had been women. Who knew? But that has really changed our vision of the French Revolution and many other things. And I don't know in what directions the study of the French Revolution will go in the future. That's no longer up to me. That's up to people your age. But it is such a complicated, fascinating event that I have no doubt that we will continue to discover new aspects of it.
And we have some questions about process, and you
Yes.
mentioned your experience with the press, your book, Revolutionary News, the press in France, 1789 to 1799,
Yeah.
obviously dealt with
The
this.
only one of my books on the revolution that is also available in French, by the way.
Look it
La
up,
Presse de la
folks.
Révolution Française, Odile Jacob.
And you wrote that yourself in French, correct? Or did you write
With a great deal of help.
It's admirable. It's admirable.
I hired a friend who is a traductrice diplômée, and we worked over every line of that book together.
Well, we have questions about how you what you use for your research. Obviously, you spoke a lot about the Duchenne,
Yes.
but where did you acquire? You talked about how you would never learned at all about the role of the French colonies in the revolution. So, and I don't know how much you can credit or discredit journalism at the time for covering topics that may have been not taboo.
One of the things that is very ironic now, when I was a graduate student working my way through hundreds of French revolutionary newspapers for a long time for my dissertation, anytime I saw a story about the French colonies, I just ignored it. Since nobody had ever told me that I should be looking for that kind of material, I thought this can't be of any interest. It has nothing to do with the French Revolution, or surely Georges Lefebvre would have told us about it. So years later, when I got interested in the subject, I was condemned to go back and look at the same newspapers again. And there are plenty of stories about the colonial issues and race and slavery in the press. It's not the biggest theme in these papers, but it is there all the way through the revolution. Every major figure in the revolution, at some point or other in his or her career, deals with it. So they were all aware of it. But I also spent a lot of time with the original documents in the French National Archives. There is a long series of what they call cartons in the archives, full of hundreds and hundreds of pieces of paper about these issues and how the revolutionaries dealt with them. And there are other documents scattered all over the world. About 6 or 7 years ago, I spent a day in the British National Archives in Kew in London, and they have cartons and cartons of letters from French colonists that were seized by British ships. People wrote letters from Saint-Domingue. The British seized the letters and they were never delivered, and nobody has looked at them, and they are all sitting in the archives in London, because what French historian thinks of going to London to do research on a subject like that?
Yeah, and what American thinks of coming to the American Library in Paris for research on the French Revolution. But
do you have documents I haven't discovered?
you never know. You're our document. You're a living document right now.
Okay.
But I have one final question. It's a lighter question. Apart from Danton, are there any other films or novels about the revolution that you would recommend?
It is surprising that there have not been many really great films, I think, about the French Revolution. Everybody knows about La Marseillaise, the film that was made in 1938 for the 150th anniversary of the Revolution. It's by Jean Renoir, I think, the director, if I got that wrong. When I teach a class to undergraduates, I often assign Anatole France's novel Les Dieux ont soif, The Gods Will Have Blood. It's not a great novel, but it's a very effective novel for teaching purposes. Plus, it's fairly short, which my students appreciate. The great novel about the French Revolution is Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. Historically, it's completely wrong, but man, what a read! What unforgettable characters and scenes. So, but it's a challenge to write about. Some very great novelists have tried, and I think not terribly successfully. Hilary Mantel, I'm sure you lend out her books on a regular basis, but I would say that her Place of Greater Safety is not her greatest historical novel.
Yeah, I just finished Wolf Hall a week ago, and I was like, I don't know if it's most appropriate that I finish her book, a work of historical fiction, after I finish yours. Probably a little bit of the truth there, but
historical fiction can be a very effective way of imagining history. And in terms of novels about the French Revolution, one that really got me interested in the Haitian Revolution is the American novelist Madison Smart Bell's trilogy, All Souls Rising, and the 2 volumes that follow. He did a very good job with that event. And Thomas Flanagan's The Year of the French on the Irish uprising that is inspired by the French Revolution, the uprising of 1798, is a wonderful novel. So there are a lot of them. They're not all set in France.
We appreciate the recommendations, and many of those are available at the library for anyone who's interested.
I should hope so.
Dr. Popkin, thank you so much for your presentation tonight and for answering as many questions as we could get to. It's really been a pleasure to have you here, if only virtually.
Well, thank you very much. And it's been a pleasure for me too. And hopefully we can all meet in Paris again.
Exactly. A bientôt. Exactly.